If you've ever been doubted, underestimated, or told you don't belong, this story is for you. Karoline Leavitt, a rising voice in politics, faces off against a seasoned intellectual giant. But what happens when the one meant to be silenced refuses to shrink? The grand hall of the Astoria Forum hummed with anticipation, its towering bookshelves and marble columns a silent witness to decades of intellectual sparring. Tonight, the air was thick with quiet expectation, an unspoken certainty among the scholars, journalists, and policymakers seated in the dimly lit audience. This was no ordinary debate. It was a proving ground, a stage where ideas were tested and reputations were either solidified or shattered. At the center of it all sat Victor Langley, the evening's debate moderator, a man whose name commanded respect and, for many, a degree of fear. He was an institution in himself, a celebrated historian whose sharp critiques had made and broken careers. Langley was known for more than just his scholarship. He was a gatekeeper, a figure who decided who was worthy of serious discourse and who was not, and tonight his target was clear. Across from him sat Karoline Leavitt, young, poised, and notably unshaken by the weight of the moment. She had faced difficult conversations before, but tonight was different. The room was not just watching, they were waiting. Waiting for the moment she would falter, for the moment Langley would strip away her credibility with the ease of a man who had done it 100 times before. The murmurs before the debate had made their expectations clear. She was too young, too inexperienced, too bold for her own good. This wasn't just a test of her arguments, it was a test of her right to be here at all. Langley leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, his expression that of a man who had already won. "Welcome, Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice dripping with the quiet condescension of someone humoring an unqualified guest. "Shall we begin?" A faint chuckle rippled through the audience, but Karoline barely acknowledged it. Instead, she met Langley's gaze with the same steadfast resolve that had brought her here in the first place. "Let's," she said simply. The hall quieted, the debate had begun. The invitation had arrived a week ago, printed on thick, embossed stationery, an old-fashioned touch that reeked of tradition and exclusivity. The Astoria Forum debate was not an event one simply walked into, it was an institution, a battlefield where only the most seasoned minds were granted a seat. That's why, when Karoline Leavitt saw her name listed as one of the invited speakers, she knew exactly what it meant. This wasn't an opportunity, it was a test, a challenge, carefully disguised as an honor. She wasn't being invited to contribute, she was being invited to fail. The moment she read the details, she knew who was behind it. Victor Langley, a historian, a professor, and a figure so deeply entrenched in academia that his opinions were treated as gospel. He had spent decades moderating these debates, systematically tearing down anyone who lacked the traditional credentials he deemed necessary. His reputation was built on reducing young, ambitious thinkers to nervous wrecks before an audience eager to see them exposed. Langley didn't just question, he dismantled. He didn't debate, he discredited. And this time, she was his target. Colleagues had warned her, "Are you sure you want to do this? Langley doesn't debate in good faith." Others were more direct. "He's going to humiliate you." Even those who supported her cause hesitated. She was brilliant, yes. But was she ready? Karoline didn't need their doubts to recognize the risks. She knew how these debates worked. They weren't about facts or arguments. They were about power, about control. Langley wasn't interested in a real discussion. He wanted a spectacle, a moment where he could raise an eyebrow, deliver a single cutting remark, and watch as another challenger crumbled under the weight of his authority. And yet, despite all the warnings, Karoline never hesitated. She had built her career on pushing forward when others expected her to step back. She had been questioned before, dismissed, patronized, challenged, but she had never been broken. So she sent back her response without a second thought. "I accept." The towering doors of the Astoria Forum swung open with a low creak as Karoline Leavitt stepped inside. The hall was breathtakingly grand, its high vaulted ceiling lined with ancient portraits of scholars and statesmen, men who had shaped policy, philosophy, and academia for centuries. It was a space designed to remind newcomers of the weight of tradition, a silent declaration that this was not just a debate hall. It was a proving ground where only the most distinguished voices belonged. The moment she entered, she felt the weight of 100 gazes land on her. Some measured, some skeptical, some outright dismissive. She recognized the looks, the same kind she had faced time and time again from those who believed expertise was reserved for a select few. Some panelists murmured among themselves, and in the audience, a few journalists whispered, no doubt speculating about how long she would last against Langley. Karoline caught snippets of their hushed conversation. She's ambitious, but she doesn't stand a chance. Langley is going to bury her. This should be interesting. If they expected her to waver, they were about to be disappointed. She had walked into plenty of rooms where she wasn't welcome, and each time she had left them with no choice but to take her seriously. At the center of the stage, Victor Langley was already seated, his posture relaxed, his demeanor that of a man who had done this many times before. He wore a tailored three-piece suit, his silver-rimmed glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he flipped through his neatly stacked notes. When he looked up at her, it wasn't with curiosity, it was with assessment. A quiet, knowing smirk played at the corner of his lips. He stood as she approached, extending a hand. A gesture that under different circumstances might have seemed cordial, but Karoline knew better. It wasn't a greeting, it was a performance, a way to establish who controlled the room. "Miss Leavitt," Langley said smoothly, his voice carrying the weight of quiet authority. "Quite the honor to have you here." So the words weren't overtly hostile, but the implication was clear. You are the guest, I am the authority. Karoline met his gaze and shook his hand, firm but measured. "The honor is mutual, Professor Langley," she replied, her tone polite but unyielding. He held her grip for a second longer than necessary before releasing it, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. He was testing her, waiting for her to shrink under his gaze. She didn't. The room was silent as they took their seats. The moderator cleared his throat and the cameras flickered on. The stage lights bore down on them, making the air thick with expectation. The audience leaned in. The match had begun. Victor Langley folded his hands neatly on the polished oak desk, exuding the calm authority of a man who had spent decades shaping intellectual discourse. He had done this before, many times. He knew the rhythm of control, the cadence of power. The key was to establish dominance early, to subtly remind his opponent and the audience of the vast chasm between experience and ambition. Tonight would be no different. He began with a slow, knowing smile. "Miss Leavitt, you've made quite a name for yourself in recent years. Some might say, too quickly." His voice was even, measured, but the intent was clear. A light chuckle rippled through the audience, a few panelists exchanging glances, already anticipating her stumbling response. Karoline didn't flinch. She had expected this. She let a beat of silence pass, just long enough for Langley to believe he had caught her off guard, before tilting her head slightly. "Experience isn't measured in years, Professor Langley. It's measured in impact." Her voice was steady, controlled, with the slightest edge of confidence. Langley's smirk didn't fade, but she saw the flicker in his expression, the first sign that he had not caught her off balance as easily as he had hoped. "Ah," he mused, leaning back slightly, "but isn't that what every ambitious young professional says before realizing they're in over their head?" It was a classic move. Frame her as naive before the debate even began. Make her prove she deserved to be here before she even had the chance to make an argument. Karoline didn't blink. "I don't believe knowledge has a set waiting period," she said smoothly. "If someone is competent, prepared, and effective, why should they be required to wait their turn before their voice matters?" Langley let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly as if amused. "That's the thing about younger generations, always in a rush," he remarked, his tone slipping into something almost condescending. "You speak about preparation, but let's be honest, experience matters, and frankly, many would argue that you haven't paid your dues." Another carefully veiled dismissal. The audience shifted slightly, some nodding, others waiting to see how she would respond. Karoline kept her expression neutral, her hands steady on the table. "I think the idea of paying dues is often used to keep people in their place," she countered. "What exactly are we talking about here? An arbitrary number of years before someone is taken seriously? Because I don't think that's how progress works." Langley's fingers drummed against the desk. The smirk remained, but it was more calculated now. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't falling into the expected patterns of flustered justifications or rehearsed sound bites. Instead, she had done something far more dangerous. She had taken control of the conversation. Victor Langley's smirk deepened, though the amusement in his eyes had dimmed. This wasn't going the way he had planned. By now, most young debaters would have stumbled, backpedaled, or at the very least conceded an inch. But Karoline Leavitt had given him nothing. Not a flinch, not a flicker of uncertainty. She met his every question with sharp precision, refusing to let him box her into the role of the uninformed upstart. So he changed tactics. Leaning forward slightly, he adjusted his glasses and tapped his fingers against the polished desk. "All right, Miss Leavitt, let's address the elephant in the room," he said, his voice taking on a tone of measured authority. "You speak about competence and preparation, but in today's world it has never been easier for someone to gain influence without truly earning it. Social media amplifies voices that, in past generations, might have been ignored, and often for good reason." A murmur rippled through the audience. Langley was shifting the debate to credibility, subtly painting Karoline as a product of modern hype rather than real expertise. It was an elegant move, one that had worked countless times before. Discredit the platform, and you discredit the person standing on it. Karoline folded her hands neatly on the table, her expression unreadable. She could see where he was steering this, and she wasn't about to let him dictate the terms. "It's funny," she said after a brief pause, her voice calm but edged with something sharp. "People in power always say that, right up until the moment someone younger, someone different, outperforms them." Langley's lips pressed into a thin line. Karoline didn't stop. Then suddenly the conversation isn't about skills, results, or facts, it's about credibility. The goalposts move. She gestured slightly. "You talk about social media as if it's somehow less valid than traditional platforms, but let's be honest, Professor. How many influential voices throughout history gained their platform not because of their merit, but because they were born into the right family, knew the right people, or were simply given opportunities that others weren't?" A few members of the audience stirred, exchanging quiet glances. Langley let out a short chuckle, though there was an unmistakable edge to it. "So, you're saying expertise doesn't matter?" he countered smoothly. "Not at all," Karoline said, shaking her head slightly. "I'm saying expertise isn't exclusive to people who have been doing the same thing the same way for decades. Sometimes the ones asking new questions are the ones actually moving things forward." Langley's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. This was not the easy dismantling he had planned. He could feel the room shifting, not entirely in Karoline's favor, but certainly away from his automatic authority. He exhaled slowly, then gave a slow nod. "Fair point," he conceded, his voice measured. "But let's acknowledge the risk here. We live in an era where opinions are thrown around carelessly, where people present themselves as experts without the depth of knowledge to back it up. Do you think it's possible that your confidence comes from the fact that, up until now, no one has really challenged you?" It was a final push, an attempt to make her second-guess herself. Langley was playing the long game. If he couldn't outright discredit her, he could at least plant a seed of doubt in the minds of the audience. Karoline let a silence settle between them before responding. "I think people confuse confidence with arrogance," she said, her tone unshaken. "I've been challenged plenty, but being questioned by people who assume they already know better, that's not the same as being wrong, that's just gatekeeping." Langley's jaw tightened, just slightly, before he forced another smirk. But Karoline had seen it. For the first time he was frustrated. Victor Langley inhaled deeply, his fingers tapping against the desk in an unconscious rhythm. He was recalibrating, searching for the angle that would tilt the conversation back in his favor. He wasn't used to this. Debates, for him, were a carefully orchestrated dance where he led, dictated the steps, and watched as his opponent struggled to keep up. But Karoline Leavitt was refusing to follow his rhythm, so he played his next card. He reached for the neatly stacked papers in front of him, lifting one as though presenting an exhibit in a courtroom. Theatrics, designed to give his words an air of irrefutable authority. "Since we're discussing credibility, let's talk about something tangible," he said, his tone slow and deliberate. He glanced down at the paper, as if reading from it, though Karoline knew he had already memorized every word. "There have been claims that, in your previous public discussions, you have conveniently omitted certain facts to fit your perspective, that, at times, your framing of issues is strategic rather than entirely objective. Would you say that's a fair criticism?" There it was, not just an attack on her qualifications, but an attack on her integrity. The room seemed to still. The panelists, the journalists, even the students in the back row, they were waiting. This was the moment where most debaters, caught off guard, would fumble, rush to defend themselves, or scramble to shift the blame. Langley knew this. This was his specialty. But Karoline didn't rush, she didn't fidget, she didn't let even a flicker of uncertainty show. Instead, she did something Langley didn't expect. She smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, just enough to signal that she saw his move for what it was. Then, she leaned slightly forward, her voice calm, steady. "Professor Langley, you've been in academia for decades. I assume you understand how framing works." Lang's brows lifted slightly. He hadn't expected her to redirect this toward him. Every argument, every debate, every historical analysis, they all involve framing. You choose which details to highlight, which sources to emphasize, which narratives to focus on. She gestured toward his stack of papers. "Even this moment, you're choosing to frame me as someone who is intentionally misleading rather than someone presenting a well-submitted perspective. That's not objectivity, that's framing." A shift rippled through the audience. Langley blinked, his fingers pausing in their rhythmic tapping. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Karoline continued, her voice unwavering. "So let's be honest with ourselves. Everyone frames arguments. The question is not whether framing happens, it's whether the framing is fair, well-reasoned, and supported by evidence." She let that settle before delivering her final strike. "And if you think I left out something important, you're more than welcome to bring it up and let me address it." A challenge, an open, unapologetic invitation. Langley hesitated for half a second too long. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the audience felt it. The energy in the room shifted. The spectators who had entered expecting Karoline to be dismantled were now seeing something else entirely. She wasn't defending herself, she was controlling the debate. Langley exhaled sharply, feigning amusement. "That's an interesting perspective," he said, but the lightness in his voice was strained. He smoothed an invisible wrinkle in his sleeve, a tiny flicker of movement that Karoline recognized for what it was, a tell. He had lost his footing. For the first time that night, Victor Langley was on the defensive. Victor Langley straightened in his chair, inhaling deeply through his nose. He had one more move left. It wasn't his strongest play, but at this point he needed to regain control, or at least leave a dent in Karoline's momentum. "So let's talk about something bigger than framing," he said, his voice measured but laced with something sharper, desperation, though he masked it well. "You've built a reputation on confidence, on challenging traditional perspectives. But there's a difference between being persuasive and being truly qualified." He leaned forward slightly, voice dropping just enough to make it seem like he was offering something profound. "At what point does confidence become arrogance?" The audience stilled. Some leaned in, sensing what Langley was trying to do. If he couldn't outmaneuver her, he would try to plant doubt in her integrity. He wanted her to second-guess herself. He wanted the audience to ask the question, was she actually knowledgeable, or just good at making it seem that way? Karoline let a bead of silence stretch between them. The weight of the question hovered in the air. She could have rushed to respond, could have tried to immediately disprove the accusation, but she didn't. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, considering him. She recognized the move. Finally, she spoke. "Confidence is only arrogance when it isn't backed up by results," she said, her voice even, unwavering. "And I think we both know that if I had stumbled tonight, if I had struggled to answer your questions, this conversation wouldn't be about arrogance. It would be about incompetence." Langley's fingers curled slightly against the desk. She had exposed the double standard. Karoline continued, pressing forward before he could interject. "People like me are expected to prove ourselves twice over, to apologize for being sure of our own expertise. But the reality is, confidence doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from preparation, from experience, from earning the right to sit at this table." She let her words settle before adding, "And I wouldn't be here if I hadn't earned it." Langley parted his lips slightly, but no words came. For the first time all evening, he had nothing to say. The weight of Karoline's final words settled over the room like a heavy fog, thick and undeniable. No one spoke. The audience, once filled with hushed whispers and murmurs of expectation, now sat in stunned silence. Even the panelists, who had been poised to interject throughout the debate, exchanged uncertain glances. The atmosphere had shifted, not in Karoline's favor, not in Langley's, but in the undeniable realization that something had just happened that no one had expected. Victor Langley, the man who had built a reputation on dismantling challengers, the one whose sharp critiques had ended careers before they even began, sat with his hands folded, staring at Karoline. For the first time all evening, his smirk was gone. The moderator, sensing the tension, cleared his throat. "Well," he said, forcing a neutral smile, "that was certainly a thought-provoking discussion." His words were an attempt to smooth over the moment, to transition away from the realization hanging in the air. Karoline didn't move to fill the silence. She didn't need to. Slowly, movement returned to the room. A journalist scribbled a final note, a panelist adjusted her microphone, a student in the back row exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath the entire time. "And Langley?" He exhaled sharply, flipping through the papers in front of him, not because he needed them, but because it was something to do with his hands. Karoline had walked into the room an outsider. She left it as something else entirely. Karoline stepped out of the Astoria Forum into the crisp evening air, the cold biting at her skin, but she barely noticed. The weight of the debate still lingered in her mind, not as a burden, but as a realization. She had won, not in the way debates were traditionally scored, but in a way that mattered more. The whispers in the hall, the unreadable glances from the panelists, the silence that had stretched too long after her final words, they all told the same story. As she pulled out her phone, her notifications were already flooded. Clips of the debate were spreading, people dissecting her performance, not because she had survived, but because she had dominated. She hadn't just held her own against Victor Langley, she had rewritten the rules of the conversation. She caught movement in her peripheral vision. One of the junior assistants from the debate team, a young woman who had barely spoken to her before the event. Now she hesitated, then stepped forward. "That was..." The assistant stopped, searching for the right words. Finally, she just shook her head, a small, almost disbelieving smile on her lips. "That was... something else." Karoline returned the smile, small, knowing, yeah, it was. As she walked away from the forum, she realized something. This debate hadn't been about proving herself to Langley, to the panelists, or to the audience. It was about proving that voices like hers didn't need permission to exist. And after tonight, no one would ever doubt that again. The story of Karoline Leavitt's debate at the Astoria Forum is a powerful reminder that credibility isn't granted, it's taken. Throughout history, gatekeepers like Victor Langley have controlled conversations, deciding who is worthy of being heard. But Karoline's unwavering confidence and sharp intellect prove that expertise isn't measured in years, but in impact. Her story teaches us that when facing doubt and condescension, the greatest weapon isn't aggression or defensiveness, it's composure, preparation, and truth. Karoline didn't win because she yelled the loudest. She won because she refused to let others define her worth. She understood that people in power will always question those who challenge the status quo, not because they are wrong, but because they are different. More importantly, this story reveals a deeper truth. Respect isn't something you wait for, it's something you command. Karoline's victory wasn't just personal, it was a statement to every underestimated voice watching. The lesson? Don't wait for permission to be taken seriously. Show up, stand firm, and make them listen, because when confidence is backed by substance, even the most powerful critics will have no choice but to sit in silence.